Welcome, everyone. It is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today for this session of Keeping Kids Safe, focused on protective factors. People will continue to join, and that is just fine. My name is Christy Gagne, and I'm a program manager for Telehealth ROCKS. And Telehealth ROCKS is a federally funded program that focuses on school-based behavioral health. We've got just a couple of reminders for you. This session is being recorded, and we will send it to you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but please feel free to use the chat or unmute to talk and ask questions. And then please make sure that your first and last name are either visible on your Zoom screen so that we can track attendance, or that you type your name and organization into the chat. We have no disclosures, and everything presented today is evidence-based and accepted within the profession. And then just a few reminders for after the session. We will send the slides and recording to you just as soon as they're processed. Give us a little bit of time to get those out to you. They'll come via email, and they should come tomorrow. And then, since this is our last session, we will be sending certificates of attendance after this session for all of the spring sessions that you have attended. That will come through your email. We also have a survey after this session, and it will be in your inbox, and we would really love your feedback on this series. We really do look at all of the responses, and we use them to plan future trainings. And then if you have any other questions, feel free to email us. I will hand it off to our presenters, Meg and Lydia, to introduce themselves and get us started.
Thank you, Christy. My name's Meg Hasselman. I use she, her pronouns. I am a licensed master of social work, and I work for HeadQuarters Kansas as the Suicide Prevention Center Programs Coordinator, which is a mouthful of a title. I should talk to my boss about that. I am primarily responsible for training and education across the state of Kansas for organizations who are looking to improve their suicide care, suicide programming. And love partnering with Telehealth ROCKS to talk about prevention because I am so very passionate about it. Lydia, I'll hand it to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Meg. Hi, everybody. My name is Lydia Fuquay, she, her. I am a prevention program manager at DECA. We'll talk a little bit about what DECA is here in just a minute. My primary responsibility right now is to support youth substance use prevention efforts in Douglas County, Kansas, in the northeastern part of the state. So that's a little bit about me. Happy to be here with you all today.
Go ahead and advance the slide. You go first, since DECA's first on there.
Okay, that sounds great. So for those of you who aren't familiar with DECA, we are a nonprofit agency. We provide a variety of human services. Our goal is really to improve the quality of life for the folks that we serve across the lifespan. So adults, youth, children, families, anybody that we can engage with. We provide residential and outpatient behavioral health care. We also provide fostering and adoption services. We're one of the contractors for the state of Kansas for that, in addition to providing family preservation services as well. And then we also do traffic safety and substance misuse prevention for the state of Kansas as well. We've been around for 50 years this year, and we have locations throughout Kansas and also in Oklahoma, Iowa, and a little bit in Missouri. So that's DECA.
Sweet. HeadQuarters Kansas is, primarily responsible or known for answering 988. If you know what 988 is, give me some sort of indication, whether it be an emoji reaction or a literal thumbs up, just out of curiosity. Sweet. Many of you know. So for those of you who don't, 988 is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It's a line that you can engage in support surrounding things like suicide crises, mental health crises, really any type of mental health distress in general. You don't have to be suicidal to utilize the number. You can call if you've just had a really bad day and you're looking for a supportive ear to talk to, or if you're worried about someone, right? So there's so many reasons that you can utilize 988. It's sort of like 911, but for mental health emergencies. We also do a lot of training, education, and consultation around suicide prevention and suicide care in behavioral health settings, healthcare settings, other organizations, schools are a huge piece of the work that we do. And then we also do some policy and advocacy at the State House, supporting legislation that will improve suicide care, providing testimony and that kind of thing. And then we also do public awareness campaigns to promote 988 and mental health awareness in general. Quick snapshot of what we do, really. Go ahead and take us to the next slide.
All right, so this is our roadmap for our time together today. We're going to dig into the past topics that were covered through the entirety of this Keeping Kids Safe webinar series. Then we'll talk about what risk and protective factors are, focusing primarily on protective factors today, and strategies for building those protective factors in our schools, in our communities, specifically through a couple of different models. So thinking about it through the social perspective and the community perspective as well. So that's what we're digging into today. Meg, I think I'm kicking it to you for our first poll though.
Yes, indeed. So we have, we're wanting to gather some information from you all, just to sort of level set on how familiar you are with risk factors that increase the likelihood of a youth experiencing adverse health outcomes. So you should have all received a poll that popped up. Go ahead and take a moment to answer that. So I'm seeing some varying responses. Looks like the cool thing that I'm seeing is that nobody is marking not familiar at all. So that's really cool. Around 20% say they're somewhat familiar with risk factors. About 30% have a basic understanding, and almost 50% say they're very familiar with what risk factors are. So thank you for painting that picture for us. Hopefully we're not gonna share too much of redundant information, but I always say a nice opportunity for review is helpful sometimes, right? Okay, we also have another poll. How familiar are you with protective factors that decrease the likelihood of a youth experiencing adverse health outcomes? So we're just curious about the protective factors versus risk factors perspective. Again, not seeing anyone marking not familiar at all, so that's cool and good. About hovering between 10 and 11% are somewhat familiar. Around 52% say they have a basic understanding of what protective factors are and how to build them. And then around 40% are saying, I'm very familiar with protective factors and how to support youth in identifying what those protective factors might look like. So thank you for helping us sort of take the temperature of the room and understand where everyone's landing. I want to, before we move on, just say that Lydia and I are both really casual presenters. So if anybody has anything to add, anything they want to share, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute and let us know. We are certainly not the only people in this room that have wisdom around risk and protective factors and how to build them. So a casual conversation is always, I think, more effective than Lydia and I just yapping your ears off about things that we know. So, all right, go ahead and move us forward, Christy.
All right. So like Meg said, it's great to have a sense of where you all are at in terms of your level of familiarity and comfort with risk and protective factors. We're going to tee up this conversation just briefly by providing like a 10,000 foot view of what we're talking about here to level set. So when we think about the role of prevention specifically in impacting behavioral health outcomes, the things that we've dug into through this series, what prevention science tells us is that the strategies that we engage in are most effective when we address risk and protective factors. So what does that mean? We want to define risk and protective factors, right? We as individuals have biological and psychological characteristics that either put us at risk for or protect us from mental and emotional and behavioral health problems. And we need to keep in mind, right, that we don't as individuals exist in isolation. So we're all part of families, communities, and the broader society. And then within each of those contexts, there are a variety of risk and protective factors as well. This is called the social ecological model. We know that prevention efforts are most effective and most impactful when addressing all levels of the social ecological model, because it can be more effective and have a bigger impact if we expand our focus to include strategies across these multiple levels. Next slide, please. I love to think of risk factors as the rain and protective factors as the umbrella. We tend to hear a lot more about risk factors than protective factors, right? A lot of our efforts to improve child and adolescent health typically have focused on those strategies that are designed to address specific risk factors to reduce those risk behaviors and outcomes. But what we're starting to see, and why we're focusing on protective factors today, is that results from a lot of studies are suggesting that greater impacts might actually be achieved by also enhancing protective factors that help young people avoid those risk behaviors that place them at risk for adverse health outcomes. So we're starting to shift and see that prevention is not just about eliminating those negative behaviors. It's also about supporting those positive behaviors and those positive environments so that we can really optimize overall well-being of individuals, families, communities, and ultimately societies, right? Protective factors also serve as a buffer for young people against harmful effects of negative situations and events that they might encounter. I also want to preface that it's important to understand that these protective factors and risk factors specifically that increase our risk for developing a behavioral health issue are not a guarantee. We don't want to misstate that. But when we understand these risk factors and protective factors, that can give us a more comprehensive understanding of a young person's relationship to these issues and how we can support them more effectively. Meg, I'll turn it back over to you.
You know, I put that umbrella image in there just for you, Lydia.
I love it. I think it's the best way to describe this.
It's really helpful for sure. Okay, so go ahead and advance to the next slide. In previous Telehealth ROCKS, in this series that we've been doing, Keeping Kids Safe, well, I guess I'm curious to see from you all, who has been present for 2 or more of the previous sessions? Who has been present for 2 or more of the previous sessions? Okay, so there's quite a few of us. Awesome. So you all are familiar with the topics that have been covered: social media, substance use, bullying, self-harm, and disordered eating. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time reviewing these since there have been whole sessions dedicated to these topics, but it is important to connect all of the work that we've been doing together over these past few months through these learning opportunities, right? So when we look at the topics that have been covered thus far, what you'll notice is that they all, when we're looking at them just on this list here, they all fall into the risk factor category, right? But during those sessions, the presenters and experts really provided insight into the risk factors, how to navigate those varying topics when working with youth. And so I just want to quickly talk about some takeaways that we've found to be really important from those past sessions. So during the social media presentation, sorry, I had a brain blank there. One thing that really stuck out is that community-driven efforts, including those that take place at school, are really the most effective in helping youth to navigate social media in a healthy manner, right? For substance use, connectedness is incredibly protective against substance use disorders and other behavioral health issues. When we looked at bullying, there are a number of ways that parents, schools, educators can help to prevent bullying and respond appropriately when bullying does happen. And then in the self-harm session, one thing that stuck out is that there are effective interventions to treat youth who engage in self-harm. And safety planning, or creating a safety plan, is one evidence-based approach that can improve safety outcomes for youth. And then during the disordered eating session, following best practices, school personnel can play a huge role in working together with students, families, communities, primary care treatment teams to support early interventions and recovery. So as I was kind of going through the review of those past topics, something that popped out to me and became really evident is that connection is such a huge protective factor for really all people across the lifespan, but specifically youth. When we're talking about how to support youth, how to build protective factors, what strategies to use, connectedness and connection is one of the most effective strategies that we can utilize. So we'll talk a little bit more about specific strategies going forward, but keep that idea of connectedness or connection in mind as we talk through the best ways that we can work with youth to identify protective factors in building those. Okay, go ahead and advance on. All right, so as I have just mentioned, protective factors are, or I guess Lydia kind of covered this more so than me, but protective factors are characteristics that seek to decrease the likelihood of someone having an adverse experience. The examples listed here are just some examples of protective factors that can help to outweigh risk factors. So when we look at substance use, one thing that we know is really effective in providing protection against a substance use disorder being developed is parental, I left out a T there, my bad, parental or caregiver involvement. So that's that family domain. Lydia kind of talked through that social ecological model. So that falls under that family category. A risk factor being suicide. One of the protective factors that helps to fight against suicide risk is community connectedness. So there's that word again, right? Community connectedness. Bullying, supportive parents or caregivers, so that family domain, youth who self-harm or at risk of self-harm benefit from, again, that connectedness piece. Disordered eating, parental or caregiver supervision is particularly protective. Intimate partner violence, having a deep attachment to school or feeling like they belong as part of a school in their school community is hugely protective. Mental health, participation in sports teams, clubs, community, religious groups, so on and so forth, connected to that community piece. And then problem gambling, parental and caregiver supervision is really protective. So these are just some ways, right, to target prevention efforts in building protective factors. It doesn't mean that these are the only protective factors that are effective in supporting youth who are experiencing these risk factors. It's just one example, and we wanted to be able to paint for you so that you could see that where there are risk factors, there are also protective factors. I think sometimes we get really caught up in this mindset that like we can't really control what's putting youth at risk. And while I hear that sentiment, I also disagree with it. There are plenty of things that we can do to really support building protective factors. Not saying that having protective factors present in someone's life negates the fact that risk factors also exist, because that's not the point, right? It's just the point being made is that we can build protective factors. People are not simply just their risk factors. Does that make sense? Sweet. Okay, go on and head to the next slide for me. Thank you.
All right. So Meg really introed this really well when we're thinking about shifting or enhancing our focus to consider protective factors. There's a lot of conversation. You all are very familiar, I'm sure, with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. We've used that study to shape how we think about reducing risk factors. But in 2019, there was a study released by Johns Hopkins that explored positive childhood experiences, or PACEs. The study included almost 6,200 adults, and it was seeking to identify positive childhood experiences that could really buffer against the health effects of the traumatic experiences that individuals face. And the study determined that there are really 7 positive childhood experiences that can be statistically linked to good emotional and mental health in adults. You can see on the screen here those 7 experiences. The good news is, and probably something you already likely know, is that the brain is plastic, right? The body wants to heal. The brain is continually changing in response to its environment. And so if toxic stress can be stopped or minimized and be replaced by practices that build resilience, then the brain can slowly undo many of those stress-induced changes. There is a lot of research on how our brains and bodies can become healthier through these 7 positive experiences. These experiences can increase resilience and protect against risk from a variety of adverse health outcomes, including the ones that Meg just stepped us through. So basically, what we want to do is move upstream to reduce risk factors and increase protective factors for a whole host of issues by engaging intentionally around these positive experiences. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? What are some approaches that we can take for building protective factors? We're going to start first with some systems approaches, thinking about system building to support protective factor approaches. And then we'll kind of move into community, school, and individual approaches. So that's our roadmap for the next couple slides here. Next slide, please. So let's start first with system approaches. What we know in prevention is that effective policy change has the biggest impact on environmental change. If we really want to impact social norms and perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, we've really got to focus on creating and/or improving existing policies that support equitable practices and support and foster protective factors. So an example of this from my slice of the prevention field, substance use prevention, would be the Clean Indoor Air Act in Kansas. On July 1st, 2010, smoking was no longer allowed in most indoor locations in Kansas, right? Now, flash forward to 2024, this is the community norm across Kansas. And ultimately, what it's doing is protecting Kansas residents from secondhand smoke, which improves community health, right? The seatbelt law, the national seatbelt law of 1968 is another example of how policy can impact environmental change and influence community norms. So if we want to focus on protective factors, we have to engage in creating policies designed to support and foster those protective factors. If we want to make environmental changes related to building and improving those protective factors in our communities, we need to review and collaborate on policies, programs, and practices that support and foster those protective factors. We also want to think about engaging a broad range of potential partners. We want to think about that internally and externally. We got to start internally. It is essential to initially engage people within our organizations, within our school systems, within our communities to make sure there's some shared understanding of why approaches that support protective factors are important to our work. From there, we're better positioned to engage with external partners, those collaborators who can work alongside you to engage in a sort of strengths-based or protective factor focused approach. Examples of partners could include, public health departments, public transportation, city and county planning, social services, education, of course, right? Essential, key. You all are here, you know this. Housing, health insurers, law enforcement, community coalitions. Of course, Meg and I are going to toot that horn coming from that sector. Victim services organizations, and so many others. The sky is really the limit, and it's unique to what is currently in existence in your community. Because the reality is building protective factors is everybody's job. It's going to take a community approach. It takes the entire village to really successfully engage in this. Similarly, to make sure our efforts are effective and meaningful, we want to ensure that administration and key decision makers are brought into this approach early on. Those decision makers can be the support that we need to make change to focus on protective factors. So it is super duper crucial to have their buy-in early. We also want to be thinking about who's not at the table, since part of building protective factors effectively in a community is engaging a broad range of partners. This often means working with sectors that maybe we haven't worked with previously. This requires a pretty consistent and intentional effort to be able to identify who you could and should be bringing into your process. We also want to think about language. We want to understand our partner's language to build common understanding and buy-in of a shared protective factor approach. When engaging with collaborators around this approach, ultimately what we're doing is focusing on commonalities in desired goals across the partnership. So for example, community connectedness across partnerships, right? Or a reduction in risk behaviors across partnerships. And we want that to be the starting point and the guide, and we can work backwards from there. The reality is, and I know I'm preaching the choir, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, this work often exists in silos, right? And so folks are likely using different words or phrases to talk about the same things. So if we start from the perspective of shared outcomes, we can work back from there and figure out what that shared language is. Just a couple more things here on this slide. We want to use evidence that our potential partners find meaningful. We want to frame this evidence in a way that makes sense for the partner we're trying to engage with. So for example, from Meg and I's vantage points, there's quite a bit of literature showing the connection between substance use and suicide. So when we started to collaborate here in Douglas County, it was critical that we understood what each of our agencies was looking to gain and to understand, and the outcomes we were trying to reach to make that partnership successful. Our job is to connect those dots for our partners and be able to frame it up for partners to increase that buy-in. And then, of course, we want to experiment. We want to think outside the box. We've often heard that what works in one community is what works in that community, right? Meaning that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to this work. It's going to take some experimentation and creative thinking to find what will be successful where you all are. Next slide, please. Let's talk about some overlapping strategies. Here's the thing. You all may already be engaging in a protective factors approach already. Likely you are. Many of these strategies might already be in your wheelhouse. So I wouldn't anticipate that anything on this list is going to be earth-shattering for you, but it's about being intentional in engaging in these efforts and finding that crossover to get at those root causes amongst many behavioral health issues. So when we think about school-based life skills curriculums, right? These are the programs with curriculum designed to be facilitated in the classroom with major program components on self-management and coping, emotion regulation, social skills. These probably feel pretty familiar to you all, right? And this is one strategy that is really effective at increasing protective factors. Mentoring programs. We know that when young people have just one trusted adult in their life who isn't like a parent or a caregiver, it can be incredibly protective against a variety of adverse health outcomes. Mentoring can help young people as they go through challenging life transitions, right? Including dealing with stressful situations at home or transitioning to adulthood, for example. So that is an incredibly effective strategy to increase protective factors. We think about community collaboratives as well. This is where our community coalition work lives. This is where Meg and I's wheelhouse is. When we can be strategic about the work we're doing and maximize our strengths as a community and figure out where our work intersects and overlaps and understand where it doesn't, we're much better positioned to bust down those silos and be more effective in this approach to increase protective factors for our young people. Parenting support and education. We know that this is an incredibly important strategy to increase protective factors in a community. There are a variety of parenting support and education programs available. The most important thing to consider when selecting a parent support and education program is seeking our community's parents and caregivers' input, what type of resources and support that they would need. We want to focus on normalizing and encouraging help-seeking behaviors and reducing stigma. We want to shift that culture, right, in our families, our schools, our communities, to encourage help-seeking when we need it, to bust that stigma against behavioral health issues. That's an incredibly important part of this work to increase protective factors. This can look like community education. This can look like training opportunities for the community, or even just reviewing all the materials that we're putting out through the lens of, are we encouraging help seeking and addressing stigma against XYZ issues? We also want to think about the sort of early childhood interventions that are the OGs of prevention. We know that when we intervene early in childhood, that can impact life trajectory in a positive direction. So we want to bolster those efforts and support those efforts that are taking place in our community. And that includes home visiting programs, right? Home visits are proven to build healthier families and relationships by supporting children, supporting parents and caregivers, and increasing parental and caregiver knowledge. There are a variety of home visiting programs already happening, already doing great work in our communities. So how do we tap in and engage with those partners and make sure those partners are at our table and have a voice? Next slide, please. I want to talk briefly about improving a shared protective factor approach before I kick it back to Meg. You can see some tips and tricks that we want to offer on the screen. A critical part of this work, and maybe the toughest part, is building a shared awareness of the relationship between behavioral health issues, like substance use, like bullying, like self-harm, like disordered eating. It's complicated, right? It's multi-layered, and not every piece of the puzzle intersects or overlaps. So it takes time and effort and voices from each of those facets to understand where that approach is shared. That's why it's critically important to include subject matter professionals from each of those vantage points, and especially those with lived experience from each of those vantage points in our efforts. We need those voices at the table to really deepen our understanding of the intersection and the overlap of these issues. And that also lends itself to a shared understanding of each facet that we're digging into through clear messaging and communication with our partners. We want to really take the time to learn about the work that's happening in our communities to prevent behavioral health issues. We've got to break out of our silos. I'm just going to keep saying that over and over and over. And we want to engage with one another to really work smarter, not harder. We're all addressing various pieces of this work from our own corner of the work. And the real magic can happen when we come together on these approaches and maximize our efforts. And again, I just want to plug one more time, focusing on those shared goals and outcomes. We want to focus on those outcomes that we're all already working on, things like community connectedness, family connectedness, community resources and support, right? Belonging, trusted adults, safety, health, wellness, all of those shared outcomes, those shared goals can really help us get grounded and rooted in the foundation of this work. It can ground us in our approach and make sure that we're making progress on increasing protective factors for a variety of behavioral health issues. Meg, I'm going to kick it back to you.
Sweet. Thanks, Lydia. Go ahead and advance to the next slide. So now we're going to shift to talk about what communities, schools, and individuals can do, or what approaches they can take to build protective factors. So I think Lydia's mentioned this term upstream a couple of times, and I want to make sure that everyone really understands what we mean when we say move upstream. Give me a thumbs up if you feel like when people say move upstream, you know what the heck they're talking about. Okay, so for those of you who do know, bear with me here. I'm going to try to get everyone up to speed pretty quickly. So moving upstream really means that we're shifting our focus of efforts for prevention to I'm going to tell a story. I think if I tell a story, it helps a little bit. Lydia loves this story. Okay, so There was a village that was situated near a stream that led to a waterfall. And there was a lady who every morning would walk her dog next to the stream. It was just part of her ritual, part of her routine. So one morning she's on her walk, walking next to the river with her dog, and she hears a shout coming from the river. And so she looks over, she sees that somebody is in the river shouting for help. So she does what any of us would do, and she ties her dog up to a tree so that the dog doesn't run away. And then she jumps into the river and she pulls the person to safety. And she goes back to the village and she's telling everybody about what happened, and everyone's celebrating her and really proud of her and excited that this happened. Not excited that the person was in the water, but excited that she saved them. Anyway, so then the next day she's out on her typical morning walk again and hears yet another shout. So she jumps back in, starts to pull that person to safety. But before she can get that person to safety, she hears another shout. So she gets to work, she pulls that person to safety, she goes back to the village and she says, we've got to do something. I have now saved 3 people, and that is not sustainable, right? So everybody in the village comes together, they train people on CPR, they build watchtowers so that people can try to get ahead of it and really notify the town when somebody has fallen into the water. So on and so forth. So the town really gets moving, and they are able to save a ton of people that are falling into the river, but they're not able to save everyone. And so one day the lady is on her morning walk, and everybody's kind of doing their thing, watching the river, lifeguards in the watchtower, right? Everyone's kind of just enjoying the morning. And she decides to turn around and walk the opposite direction of the waterfall. So she's walking upstream now. And everyone's like, where are you going? We need you. You can't leave us. And she's like, hey, I'm not going anywhere. I am walking upstream to see why people are falling into the river in the first place. That is what upstream prevention is, right? Is tackling the problem before it's impacting people in the long term, before it's impacting people on a larger scale, so on and so forth. So when we think about upstream prevention or upstream approaches, we can think about things like social emotional learning curriculums, right? Or programs like Sources of Strength. For those of you who don't know what Sources of Strength is, it is a robust protective factor program, essentially, that really works to build skills and resiliency in youth so that if they do fall into the waters, they're able to navigate it and pull themselves out quicker, right? And so when we can move upstream, we're really equipping young people to be able to navigate life's adversity with skills, with resilience, with support, so that they don't end up falling down the pattern of substance use or adverse mental health issues or self-harming behaviors or bullying, right? So we're really hoping to increase the ability to navigate tough waters when we move upstream. Creating protective environments can look so many different ways. So when you see the words create protective environments, I'm curious to hear from you all. What comes to mind? What are you all seeing in the schools or communities that you're working in that work to create protective environments? I would really love to hear from some of you about what that's looking like, so we can learn from each other. What if I just started cold calling people to share? That would be so mean. I'll give it just a couple seconds in case anyone's typing. So one thing that really, Gail says clubs at school for socialization or skill building. Absolutely. I was just about to say one thing that comes to mind for me are like boys and girls clubs programming, right? Where students are able to go after school, sometimes before school, to connect with other students and engage in some sort of programming that's working on some of those socialization skills or coping skills. If we promote connectedness, here's that word again, connectedness. When people are able to connect with their culture, connect with people who have similar interests, connect with a community of people who look like them, they are more likely to engage in healthy coping skills than someone who feels completely disconnected, right? That's why that connection piece is huge. Do I have any Brene Brown fans in the room? Or am I the only nerd? Okay, awesome. Yeah, Brene Brown talks a lot about how connection is one of the biggest protective factors that we have available to us as human beings, right? And so any opportunity for promoting connection or providing opportunities for students to connect in different types of ways is really helpful in reducing risk for tons of adverse outcomes. Coping skills and problem-solving skills are hugely protective and things that are typically involved in things like a social emotional learning curriculum or programming like Sources of Strength or other prevention programs. When students have the ability, I will get to that in just a second, Lydia. When students and people in general have the ability to learn how to identify someone who might be at risk for suicide or might be at risk for self-harm or might be at risk for substance use disorder, right? When people are equipped with the skills to identify others who might be at risk, that significantly improves outcomes and makes people feel more connected. And then lessen harms and prevent future risk, right? That's kind of the whole goal of all of this whole conversation that we're having. So Lydia brought up Eudora Middle School. They have an enrichment program before and after school clubs led by teachers for a variety of interests. Some examples are, oh my gosh, that's so cool. Grill Master Cardinals, where they learn how to grill food, wild game and fish, cleaning club, mentoring, dance club, chess club. That's amazing. So giving students the opportunity to connect over a shared interest is hugely protective. With Lydia sharing that example, did anything come to mind for you all in what you're seeing in your communities or schools? You're all like, we logged on to just listen. Stop trying to make me talk. Fair, I hear you. Okay, go ahead and advance to the next slide. So here we're just really kind of talking about ways and opportunities for cross collaboration and building this shared protective factor approach. So it is really important to identify local data sources, to identify prevention priorities, and develop a strategic plan. So one way that you can really tap into some youth data is to utilize the KCTC survey that's given out to all 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the state of Kansas, or at least the opportunity is there. Schools do have to opt in for their students to participate in that, but it is a huge data source for prevention efforts and helping us to understand where our efforts really should be targeted. Sector engagement and partnerships. So identify who is already working on certain initiatives in the community, right? And then who are the sectors with whom they are collaborating with? And then gather everyone together to discuss how people can start to work together and support each other so that we can really start to break down those silos that Lydia has been talking about. When we move into the planning phase, it's really important that that risk factors and protective factors be examined, right? For what, for how the prevention efforts can really work towards building protective factors in those areas. For strategy implementation, we want to leverage work in key settings. So schools, for example, are a really good setting for this. It's an opportunity to collaborate on community policies. So the example that we like to share is like alcohol outlet density. Where is alcohol being sold in the community, and how populated are alcohol retailers in specific areas? And then exchanging data to identify any overlaps in the community can be really helpful. It's always important to evaluate the approach that you're taking. So use that data or gather new data so that you can evaluate how are our programs, how are our efforts impacting the youth that we're working with? Is the initial strategic plan that we came up with actually impacting the deficits that we see in our communities? Or do we need to change our approach? Do we need to look at the data in a different way? And then it's always incredibly important. This really goes for everything we've been talking about today, not just this slide, but ongoing review of growing language and adapt the language as necessary. So moving away from using stigmatizing language, right, and moving towards using person-first language, so that I think that's one way that you can really start to have a robust conversation about stigma in communities and schools, is to be willing to adapt and grow and change in that way. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a few takeaways that we just want to be sure that you all, oh, actually, can you go back 2 slides? I'm sorry. I really got ahead of myself. One thing that I want to talk about when we talk about this creating protective environments is, what are we doing to prepare youth for not being plugged into school supports? So, for example, when students are going on spring break, how are we preparing them for that break? When students are going on summer break, how are we preparing them for that? A lot of students get most of their needs met by going to school, right? Maybe that's the one place they're getting a meal. Maybe that's the one place that their pronouns are respected. Maybe that's the one place where they're not facing violence, right? And so it is important to think about building protective factors for youth in the school, but also how are those going to translate into the environment that they're in when they're not at school? So some things that I think about are having really transparent conversations with students, like, hey, we're about to have a week off of school. What are you all going to do to take care of yourselves? Are you aware that 988 is available 24/7? It's free and confidential. Are you aware that the Trevor Project is this amazing resource for LGBTQ+ youth to get support should they need it? Are you aware that the local food bank is located in this place and its hours are open, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or whatever that looks like? Do we need to talk about creating a safety plan for if you're at home and you become activated and you're home alone, right? Your supports aren't there. What are you going to do? So we have, well, once we pause and give time for question, I'm going to put a link in the chat to free training that we have on our HeadQuarters Kansas website for creating safety plans. And I think that a lot of times people believe that safety planning is only something you do when you're in the midst of a crisis. But what we actually know is that when you have the opportunity to create a safety plan ahead of time, before a crisis arises, you're more likely to engage in that safety plan, and you're more likely to have a frame of reference for when you're building that safety plan, right? Because when you're in a crisis, it's much harder to remember that you do have coping skills, right, than when you're not in a crisis. So I think it can be a wonderful activity to do for prevention or preparing students for being at home for an extended period of time. Okay, go ahead and go back to that key takeaway slide. I always want to emphasize that where there are risk factors, there are also protective factors. So I said earlier that having protective factors available or strengths in our lives does not mean that risk factors aren't present. It just means that we have some more opportunity to really navigate those risk factors in a healthier or more productive way. There are simple strategies that we can utilize to support youth in increasing those protective factors. So it doesn't have to be that we're implementing this huge program and, we're doing a SEL curriculum, which is really tough in the state of Kansas right now, right? It can be that we're encouraging kids to get connected with with clubs or sports after school, or helping kids get engaged with Boys and Girls Club so that they have some connection after school, things like that. And then the last thing is protective factors can also be thought of as strengths that are present in a person's life. So at its very simplest form, protective factors are natural strengths that occur in someone's life. It doesn't mean that you don't have to work to build strength, but these are things that typically are present in someone's life that you can pour some water into the plant to watch it grow, kind of thing. Okay, I think that might be it. What's the next slide? Is there a next slide? Oh yeah. So we want to see in the chat, if you'd rather unmute, that's totally cool too. We want to hear what one strategy or activity is that you're interested in exploring to build protective factors with the youth that you engage in. What might that look like? So that could be something you're already doing, or it could be something that maybe this presentation sparked an idea for. So we'll give you a few seconds to type that out.
We are wanting to work on a community garden for our youth, to, kind of help them out.
That is a lovely idea and a really wonderful opportunity for building some skills there, to build some connection, to get their hands dirty, right? That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Jacqueline says, I really want to get sources of strength at our middle schools. Jacqueline, you should reach out to me. I'd love to talk more about that. Rachel says summer jobs for youth. Yeah, jobs are a great opportunity for youth to get out of the house and be connected and gain some pride, right? And earning some moolah. Doing more community outreach by bringing parents and families to build better connections. Yes, it is always ideal to bring parents or families into the fold, right? How can we also support the families? Because ultimately, that's going to support the kid. So anything you can do to increase family involvement is beautiful. Oh, and that's our very own Casey. Hi, Casey. Yeah, these are great examples. If there are any others, we'd love to hear them. We used to have an open gym occasionally where kids could play basketball after school. Oh yeah, I think just any type of healthy activity that youth can connect over together is always a good way to increase that connectedness. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing these examples. I think it's helpful for us in the field of prevention to hear, but also for your peers, right, who are working in the schools or working with youth to hear as well. Yes, I will put my email in the chat here, Jacqueline. And are there any questions or comments or concerns that you all have? We'd love to hear from you. Oh, thanks, Leah. Quicker than me.
I think one of the things that we struggle quite a bit in our Hispanic community is the fact that, when you were talking about alcohol and stuff, it is something very common for parents to provide, to be the ones to provide the alcohol and things, because the thought, I keep hearing this from parents. Well, I'd rather them do it under my roof and under my supervision, but they don't realize that by you providing this type of, things to your child, the drugs and the alcohol, you're diminishing their life expectancy, their lifestyle. They're growing children. The last thing that they need, it's an added thing. And on top of that, all the peer pressure that goes on into the schools, and then you have the parents or family members kind of egging them on.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a real predicament that communities face, and that a really common narrative, right? That, well, I'd rather them get it from me than someone on the street, or I'd rather that they do it in my house so I know that they're safe, when there's more that goes into that decision than just like them being safe in the moment. It's also impacting long-term brain development and long-term health, those kind of things. Yeah. And so finding ways to target efforts, right, that are, like you mentioned, that's a really big thing in the Hispanic community. Well, what are some cultural things that we can consider when putting programming in place, or when working at targeting these specific issues? I think it's really important to always consider culture and the implications of culture. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you so much for giving up an hour of your day to learn more about building protective factors. Lydia has said something lovely in the chat. Provide family education. Yeah, Lydia and I are big fans of community coalitions. We do a lot of work with coalitions in the prevention sector, and so it's a really wonderful way to get involved and have a voice at the table. Awesome.
Thanks, Meg and Lydia, for sharing today and for leading the discussion on protective factors and wrapping up our series with a great session. Thank you to everyone for joining us here today. We will send the slides and follow-up materials to your email, and they'll also be available on the Telehealth ROCKS website and Facebook page, and I will put those links here in the chat. This is our last session, and there's a survey in your email right now. We really do look at the surveys and use the feedback. Also, grant-funded programs like ours really rely on survey data, and so we appreciate you taking 2 minutes to fill it out. I promise we made it really short. So if you wouldn't mind looking for that after this session, would be wonderful. And then that's it. We will send the certificates to you via email after we have calculated all the attendance. And we've enjoyed learning with you, and we hope to see you at an upcoming training session soon. Thanks, everybody, and have a great afternoon.